Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
Thank you for coming, and my name is Debbie Liu. It's my privilege to invite Mr. Rittenberg to Microsoft CHIME Culture Task Series. So he is here to share his own experience during the China Culture Revolution. He will also discuss the cultural differences between China and the United States, as well as giving some advices to CHIME members on how to fit into American mainstream. Mr. Rittenberg is founder and president of world-class China consulting team, Rittenberg Associates, Inc. He lived and worked in China from 1944 to 1979. He witnessed firsthand of what occurred at upper levels of Chinese Communist Party, and he knew many of the leaders personally, from Chairman Mao, Zhu De, Zhou Enlai, to Deng Xiaoping, Jiang Zemin, and Xi Jinping. Now please join me to give him a warm welcome.
Thank you. I apologize for being late. It's the fault of my GPS. The GPS brought us to this neighborhood 20 minutes early, which was fine. Then it just leaves you. You know, it doesn't tell you where the building is. It says, your destination is ahead on the left. So here you have this whole city of Microsoft buildings. And how are you supposed to find building 99? Well, anyway, we finally made it. Actually, I prepared to talk in Chinese, and all my notes are in Chinese, so they're pretty well useless. But I understood that there were going to be foreigners present. So I was asked to talk in English, but I will do something. That in the old days in Shanghai, there was an English professor who spoke to his class like this. He said, some foreigners who've been living in China have the terrible habit of showing off how much Chinese they know. So while they're talking English, they throw in some words in Chinese just to show off. Yes, I'm happy to tell you that I do not have that 毛病. So my talk is going to be a little like that. I'll put some terms into Chinese if I think about it. And if I say something that anybody doesn't understand, if you just raise your hand, I'll be glad to translate it at no extra charge. Well, I was asked to talk about my experience in the Cultural Revolution. I don't think there's anyone in this room who took part in the Cultural Revolution, aside from the two of us. Is there? I think you're all much too young. Yeah. But anyway, that was 10 years, and that was a new thing in human history that I don't think has ever happened anywhere before. The pity is that it's not being studied in China today, or very little studied, very little even talked about. In school, it's a blank. And that's a great pity, because that was a very important part of Chinese history and of human history, I think. It showed us what people do when they can do whatever they like. No holds barred. Sky's the limit for a limited period of time. So here's sort of my own experience. I joined the American Communist Party as a student at the University of North Carolina. We knew nothing about revolution. We knew nothing about foreign countries, including the Soviet Union. We were working for racial equality, against prejudice and discrimination. We were working to give people in the South the right to vote. Maybe you think that every American has no problem voting. Not true. If you're in the southern states, still today, and you're a minority, you may have trouble voting. So anyway, that's what we were doing. Then in World War II, I left the Communist Party, joined the American Army, and that's how I got to China, because the reason I went to China was that I did not want to go to Japan. The reason I studied Chinese was I didn't want to study Japanese. It was very simple. I was picked out of the infantry because of a language aptitude test. And I was sent to Stanford University to learn Japanese and to be sent to Japan for military government after the war. This was 1943, so there was still 2 more years of war left. So I didn't want to be overseas after the war. I wanted to come home right after the war. And I didn't want to be in military government. Government of any kind didn't interest me at all, still doesn't. So I went to the Chinese professor and I persuaded him to get the Army to transfer me into Chinese language so I could get home right after the war. China was an ally. And it worked very well. In only 35 years, I was back home. This is a kind of a gift of prophecy. What I didn't realize would happen happened my first day in Chinese language studies. I just totally fell in love with that language and never recovered to this day. I remember when I was put in jail, locked up in solitary in China, when the door slammed shut, one of the first things I thought of was, you can lock me up, but you cannot take away my Chinese language. I already have it. So, you know, it's not like any idea that we ever had of a language. It's not like it's just another language. It's a whole new world. So anyway, so when I went to China in the Army, after the war, I stayed in China, and I managed to get myself to Yan'an. And in 1946, I joined the Chinese Communist Party, which is a completely different kind of organization. The Chinese Party in those days was like our ideal of what a Communist Party should be like. They were mainly poor people, very little difference between the leaders and the non-leaders, very little difference. And life was very simple. In Yan'an, if you met Mao Zedong walking down the street, or Zhou Enlai, you came up and said hi and struck up a conversation, no big deal. No big deal. It happened all the time. And they worked very hard to help the farm people get back into production after the war, when everything was destroyed. And they carried out the land reform that gave everybody land, and so on. So I was very much impressed. Then I had, in February 1949, all of a sudden I was arrested, thrown into a pitch black cell lived in darkness and solitary for 1 year, and then 5 more years not in darkness. And the effect on me was, I decided, I didn't know that I'd been accused by Stalin, by the Russians, of being an American spy. I thought it was a Chinese problem, which it was not. So I thought to myself, the reason they suspect me is that I'm not a good enough revolutionary. So in prison, I'm going to make myself into a better, purer communist, and then sooner or later they'll see who I am. So 6 years of that. So when I came out, I was really a very dogmatic, doctrinaire Communist Party member. Anything the party said was fine. And I saw the tremendous changes in life in China, especially in the first 5 years, from 1949 to 1954, 55, these tremendous social reforms, the 8-hour day, the end of opium. It's back now, of course, but in those days it was wiped out. End of prostitution, which is also back now. They had some foreign businessman on Chinese TV not long ago tearfully exposing his sins of making an appointment with a prostitute. Well, that's really the height of hypocrisy, because prostitution is all over, as you know, everywhere. From the 5-star hotels to wherever, the streets. It's back. But in those days, gone. And I did a study of that. I went to the schools for retraining prostitutes, teaching them useful work, helping them find husbands and get married, and it was beautiful the way it was done in the 50s. But by 1960, 61, I began having some deep suspicions that everything wasn't as good as I thought it was. I was working to translate the works of Mao Zedong into English. And actually it was some things that he wrote that were very stimulating to me. Like Mao writes, and you can see in his collected works, that a communist should ask why about everything. Should never take anything blindly on faith. Should never obey just because someone in leadership says it's right. You should use your own head to think about, is it really right or not? Things of that sort, you know. And also he wrote that a new truth, a new discovery in the beginning is always the property of one person or a very small group of people, and everyone else says they're fools. But gradually, the truth proves itself, it comes to be true, and gradually it wins the support of the majority. So these people are considered no longer fools, they're wise men. But by that time, a new truth has appeared that again is in the hands of just a small number of people who are considered fools. Therefore, it's very important to protect the rights of the minority. That's what he wrote. Just imagine how nice it would have been if he had carried it out instead of just writing it down. But as we know, for most of the time, he did not carry it out. But anyway, those things were very stimulating. And I began to raise questions in the party. Yulin and I were both working at the State Broadcasting Administration, Radio Beijing. And I wrote a letter to the director of the State Broadcasting Administration saying that Our structure is all wrong. The people who decide what can be published and what cannot be published know nothing about journalism. The people that understand journalism and are working on actually writing the programs have no authority to decide what's used and what's not used. So it's all upside down. The result is that our broadcasts are very boring, not only don't win friends, but often antagonize people. So this was a personal letter from me to him. But he circulated it among all the leadership, which got me labeled as a right-wing opportunist, and a series of struggle meetings began against me. Well, that only lasted 2 days, and then the Lu Dingyi, who was Minister of Propaganda, and actually a very lively, democratic-minded person, he telephoned the director at radio and cursed him out and said, "Stop that nonsense immediately." So they did stop and they apologized, but I felt something was very wrong. Later on in 1965, so 1 year before the Cultural Revolution, in a party meeting, I raised the issue of why should the party watch what people are saying, watch what the masses, non-party people are saying. Why should we exercise surveillance over them? Why should we have people reporting on what he's saying and she's saying and so on? They should be watching us, the party members, not us watching them. We're supposed to be the servants and they're the masters. And now it's the other way around. We're behaving like the masters and they're the servants. Well, I was a minority of one, but that got me marked at the beginning of the Cultural Revolution as one of the 3 most dangerous people at Radio Beijing, which also didn't go anywhere, however. So when the the reason I'm saying this is, when the Cultural Revolution broke out, it seemed to me like a gift from the gods. It seemed like a wonderful new day when the party was being criticized, party members were being demanded that they behave as servants of the people, and people were free to elect anyone they wanted to the leadership of their institution, of their work unit. They could criticize anybody they wanted, except for Chairman Mao and his little Cultural Revolution leading group. They could write, speak, say anything they pleased. And they could form political organizations with anyone they wanted. As long as you felt that you agreed with this guy, you and him could be a 2-man organization. And at radio, we actually did have 2 of the editors who formed their own political organization, as well as lots and lots of other political. And this was all wide open, free. Nobody could interfere. So I thought that this was really the great day. This was the day on which what was written in the Constitution was actually coming to pass. People had freedom of speech, freedom of organization, freedom of publication, and so on. And actually, Mao himself, this was one of the things that set the fire, that ignited the Cultural Revolution. When he came back from swimming the Yangtze River, or actually mainly floating across the Yangtze River, in 1966, he called an enlarged meeting of the Political Bureau of the Central Committee, in which he said, we have a beautiful constitution, and all the other socialist countries have the same kind of constitution. None of us have ever carried it out. And he said, don't you think it's about time that we carried it out? And so At that meeting, they canceled all the limitations, all the restrictions on writing big character posters, where you could put them up and who you could criticize, and it was all canceled. So I thought, well, this is a great day. Freedom under socialism, where the main thing is not what the individual can do for the collective, but what the collective can do for the individual. And that was the way, in my mind, Marxism was supposed to be. So with that, I threw myself enthusiastically into the support of the rebels, Zollverein. Enthusiastically, speaking and writing and doing everything possible, including taking considerable risks, because I thought it was worth the risk. I became a very popular figure that way, which was easy, because here's an older cadre from the Yan'an days who takes the side of the rebels, and that was rare. Very few people did that in those days. And also an American who spoke fluent Chinese, that added some color to it. And so very popular. Now, I saw the bad side of what was going on. I knew that people were being killed, innocent people were being killed, innocent children were being tortured, there was great destruction of property, and so on. But my head was on flame. I thought, this is making a new world of great freedom. And you know that famous quotation you may or may not know from Chairman Mao, a revolution is not a dinner party. Can't be so polite, so gentle, so courteous, and so on. So I ignored all of that. I thought that's bad, but it's a necessary evil. When you untie people and let them make revolution, things like that happen. I made some protests, very feeble, to the leaders, to the central leaders, about the way the senior cadre were being treated at these struggle meetings and so on, but very feeble. Basically, I went along with it and took part in it. So, in February 1968, I ended up back in solitary confinement on renewed spy charges, and that was another 16 years in solitary, which, frankly speaking, I thought was too long. I don't like to be a whiner, but I really thought it was too long. What brought that about? Well, I had a quarrel with Jiang Qing. I think that helped. Yeah. See, this is one of the negative things that destroyed all hope in the Cultural Revolution. I found out that you can't just let people alone to decide what to do and you're going to have a perfect democracy. Not going to happen. One basic reason was that everybody understood that democracy means majority rules. So we have a decision to make, we take a vote, whatever the majority wants, okay, that's what we do. Very few people understood that you have to protect the rights of the minority. Even in Tiananmen Square in 1989, we were there. Same thing. The student leaders who were in charge that day often really didn't let other students who had different opinions speak, or didn't give them an equal right to speak. So the minority view was suppressed by these rebels, just like the minority view was suppressed by the old bureaucrats. Only worse, because they were cruder. They were cruder. They didn't know there are certain things that you can't do. You have to follow the rules and the ordinary moral norms and so on. So that was bad. What happened at the radio was typical of what happened all over. And I'll give you this as an example. So the rebel regiment comes to power. I was one of the 8 people, walked into the central editorial office and told the senior editors on duty, you stay at your jobs, but from now on you're working for us. No more party committee, no more director, vice director, that's all gone. You're working for these kids, really, except for me. I was the only one that wasn't a kid. And that was very smooth. But here's an organization, the radio, of 7,000 people. And here's a bunch of young people from the editorial groups, from the carpool, from all over, who have no experience in managing that kind of organization. They can't even make the motor pool work, so the reporters can't get cars when they need to go out to do an interview. So after a few days, people that elected them, people in the rebel ranks, began complaining, saying, hey, you promised us a wonderful new democratic organization with no bureaucracy and so on and so forth, and look what's happening now. It's worse than it ever was. So then these young people who had fought hard battles for the right to speak, for the right to criticize, and finally came to power, what did they do? They were terrified at this opposition, at these complaints they were getting, and they suppressed the people who were complaining them. And they did it more crudely than the original bureaucrats had ever done. They broke open their drawers in their desks at home, confiscated their correspondence, read their diaries, looking for proof of conspiracy. They hauled them up on the stage and interrogated them to answer questions. Really crude stuff. And I opposed that openly, and Jiang Qing came to their defense, and I told her at a session that we had at the radio that you're supporting the wrong people. These people are not fit to be in charge of an institution that's supposed to have democratic management. They're suppressing their opposition. These are my own comrades, my own colleagues. They're suppressing their opposition, and that's not right. That was not considered healthy in those days to argue with Jiang Qing. But I didn't, and I was not the only one. I was not the only one. There was another, one of the announcers, a young woman, was also very brave and stood up and spoke truth to power. But anyway, from that day on, a secret investigation of me began, which ended up with me in going back to solitary. Well, I was put under house arrest on Christmas Day of 1967, which I thought was a nice touch, and hauled off to prison in February of '68. So, and as you may know, by the second half of 1967, Chairman Mao found that this Red Guard movement, which he had created and supported, did not obey him. They talked day in and day out about Mao was a god, Mao was the red, red sun in my heart, and so on. And if you listen to what they said, you would have thought they were his most loyal followers. But if you looked what they did not obey him. They fought civil wars against each other. They stole, they destroyed public property. they tortured people from the opposing organization. Not all of them, of course, but some of the major Red Guard groups. And he found that they were out of control, that his new world was not going to happen with these young people in charge. So what did he do? He sent all the student youth out to the villages to work on the farm and be transformed by the poor and lower middle peasants. That was the saying at the time. And who was in charge? He sent the army in to take over in all the units where the people had elected their own leaders. So students out, army in. And that was the end of that stage, the first year and a half of the Cultural Revolution. From then on, it was all power struggle and play acting. It was nothing worthwhile was really going on. So, you know, and I learned a lesson from that, because I used to think that all you have to do is give people the right to do whatever they like, and they will know how to behave democratically. And I saw in the Cultural Revolution, not true. People need to have a certain amount of political experience to know things like the fact that you must protect the rights of the minority. A lesson which has still not been learned. But the fact is, if the minority has no guaranteed rights, nobody really has guaranteed rights, because it can be, you can have the right to speak today and it can be taken away tomorrow. The only way of guaranteeing it for anybody is to guarantee it for everybody. That's just the way it works. And I learned that, I think, from the Cultural Revolution. But this was a great experiment. I think the first great experiment in Chinese history of trying to maintain, trying to set up a perfect democracy, a really popular regime, and making it work. And it showed what it's possible to do, and it also showed what can't be done until you reach a certain stage of development. I mean, democracy is not a simple thing. Look at us here. After what, 800 years since the Magna Carta in England, which was the first step forward in democracy in the West. And all it was, it gave the nobles, the barons, the aristocrats, the right to present appeals to the king. That's all it provided for. They had no power but the right to appeal. And even that was abolished by the king sometime later and had to be restored. So after 800 years of progress, we have a government that makes wars that most people are against. That we have a Congress, a majority of which opposes even the most minimum public health care, which most people are for, and that's our democracy. It's not that we don't have any democracy. We do have. We have the right to speak and publish. You have the right to publish your own newspaper if you have $500 million to pay for it. So actually, at the end of the day, you have as much right as you can pay for, and that's what you have. If you can't pay for it, you basically have no rights. It's like a policeman in Birmingham, Alabama, told me when I was arrested in connection with a progressive movement way back in 1940, and I said, I have a right to be here. And he looked at me with pity in his eyes, and he said, son, you ain't got no rights. Rights is what you think you got. And so that's the way it was. So democracy is a long, long struggle to implement a real democracy. The Cultural Revolution showed what is possible, and it also showed that it's only possible under certain conditions, which I believe we don't have at this point. There's still room for a lot of progress, I think. I mean, about China, my feeling is I would not like to see a multi-party system in China today. I really wouldn't, because I don't think it would make things better. I think it would make things worse. I think the best hope is to try to improve this one party for the time being, try to make it better. But there are two things that I think personally are very badly needed. One is a free press. Allow the press to discuss, to argue, debate about anything. It is not going to lead to chaos, really. If it would lead to chaos, there are thousands of chat rooms, as you know, Chinese chat rooms. Some of them are really extreme, but it doesn't lead to chaos. People learn to listen to all different kinds of opinions and not get carried away. So, but I think a free press is very badly needed. And the other thing is, it must be protection for whistleblowers. What we've had so far, you have a reporter, even Xinhua News Agency reporter, or a lawyer, or someone who exposes a bad guy, or exposes something bad. The bad guy may lose his job, but the reporter goes to jail for tax evasion or whatever. And the lawyer loses his license. Very hard to have progress until you protect whistleblowers. Recently, the government set up a special website you may know about, and they promise that anybody that exposes bad people or bad things on that government website will be protected. So I don't know whether that's going to work or not, but it's a hopeful move, it seems to me. So, Cultural Revolution. The other question, another question I was asked was about how to fit in with the American mainstream. You know, we had the same problem, actually. I came back after 35 years in China, speaking basically only Chinese, and my wife came here after never having been out of China and never having traveled much even inside China. Well, I had old comrades, old friends, and some family, so that made things easier. But I would say, my personal view, I would say two things are important. Number one, it's very important that you continue to be who you are. You do not want to change who you are. You want to be basically the same person that you grew up being. Stick to your roots and don't try to transform yourself into something that's not real, because it departs from you, it cuts off your roots, and you'll be very sorry later. I've seen some individuals like that, not many, who are, like they used to say about some foreigners in China, they're more Chinese than the Chinese. You could say about some people that come here from other countries, they're more Americans than the Americans. It's a tendency. It's also a tendency among our children growing up. They don't want to be looked at differently. They don't want to be discriminated against, so they do their best to be more American than the other American kids. But this is kind of unfortunate. We want to be who we are because that's your integrity. And your integrity, believe it or not, is the most important thing that you will ever have. If you ever get locked up in solitary, which I don't advise, you have to sit there and figure, what is there that I really can't live without? And what are the things I used to think I couldn't live without, but actually I don't need them. I can get along without them. And the one thing that you can't live without really is your own integrity. That means that you are who you seem to be. You do what you say, basically. And you mean what you say. You want to continue to be yourself. And you're Chinese originally. So those of you who become American citizens, so you're Chinese Americans, and that's fine. That's the first thing. The second thing is, of course, you want to learn the ways, the habits, and the customs, but you don't want to. You want to pick and choose which ways you want to learn. You don't want to learn all ways. You don't want to learn the habits that other Americans are trying to get rid of. They throw them down and you pick it up. That doesn't make sense. So I think it's not that hard. What's hard is to break out of your own little group that maintains your own little culture, and you don't associate with other groups. You don't associate with other people that are not part of your little mini culture. So that's not good because you get stuck in that rut. It's very hard to get out of. You want to expand. You want to be open to everything, listen to everything, and be able to make friends with all kinds of people and deal with all kinds of people. I think I'm really talking a lot of nonsense because everybody knows these things. But that's all I can say. For us, coming back was a great adventure, and it was fun. You learn how to get along. You have to learn how to get along, and at the same time, don't stop being you. You're still you. My wife, I think if you put her in another country for 200 years, she'd still be the same her. It's a very tough customer. Just imagine a young Chinese woman marries this American foreign expert who is then hauled off to prison and denounced everywhere as a hidden enemy, an imperialist spy, and she refuses to say anything against him. And she's treated like a traitor. She betrayed her nation. She sold out to this foreigner, maybe even part of his spy network. So she's beaten, spit on, cursed at, sent to labor camp at hard labor for years, doing labor that was harder than any other woman in camp was given because she was a traitor. She never bowed her head. Any job that they gave her to do, she made up her mind she's going to do it so well that it will shut their mouths up. They won't find anything to criticize her for in her work. And she survived, and she raised our 4 children the 10 years that I was away. And I think she's kind of an angel. Where is she? Yulin? Stand up. So I really lucked out. There was a third set of questions. Let me see. Oh, I had to shut my iPhone down. Debbie, what was the third set of questions? Oh, cultural differences. Well, I think the main thing is, even though this is changing, China is changing very rapidly, but basically I think it's still true. China is a we society. America is a me society. A lot of talk these days about the Chinese dream. The Chinese dream is a we dream. It's a dream about us, China, Chinese, the progress that we're going to make, the resurgence of our nation. The American dream is a me dream. It's me becoming rich and successful and famous and so on. And that's a very big difference. It's a very big difference because the whole mindset is really different. Now, of course, there's a lot of individualism in China today. There's a lot of me also going on, but it's still essentially a we society. And you can see that all over the place. I think that's the main difference in the culture. But of course, the traditions are very different, but they're compatible. When we were married 57 years ago, 1956, a lot of people were against it, including the director at radio, Wu Langxi, who was the head of the Xinhua news agency at the time, invited me to lunch, specially to advise me that I should not marry Wang Yilin. Why? Well, because cultures are too different. She'll want to talk about Peking opera and you want to talk about Shakespeare, and it won't work. Well, we were talking ourselves the other day. In 57 years, we have never had this issue about Chinese and foreigner. It's just not there. We learn from each other's culture. I learned from her to love Beijing opera. And she learned from me about Western literature and culture, and it's just never been a problem. And I don't think it needs to be a problem. We went to China with Billy Graham, you may know, the most famous American Protestant minister. And we had a session with Zhu Rongji when he was vice premier before he became premier. And Billy gave him an autographed copy of a Chinese Bible that was printed in Nanjing at the big Bible press there. And Zhu Rongji thanked him and said, as a matter of fact, I have an English copy at home, which I read from time to time, because I believe that we should know the great literature of all peoples, not just of China. And I think that's the way it works. You learn to understand and appreciate the best of American culture, lots and lots of junk, but you're not likely to appreciate that. And even more important, every one of you is a living ambassador from China, really, a kind of cultural ambassador, because ordinary Americans learn about China from knowing you. If you come across as a good person, they have a good impression of China. And your characteristics are going to impress them with what China is like. And that's something you can't escape. It's a natural thing. I don't know if we have any time for questions.
Sure. We have 15 minutes for Q&A session. So anyone here want to ask questions? You can.
Not a really question, but I thought you want to talk about the recent Jimmy Kimmel event. Please.
Jimmy Kimmel, well, that has to do with American culture, too. I mean, it was just nonsense, really. It was a 6-year-old child who just blurted out that statement which her parents would not necessarily approve of, might or might not, we don't know. And unfortunately, it was on national television, so it was something for which the TV station had to apologize, and they did apologize, and that was right. But I don't see much in it beyond that. The Jimmy Kimmel himself is not a person skilled in political maneuvering, and so he didn't handle it properly. He didn't know how to handle it. He just made it, he repeated it and made it into a joke when he should have pointed out immediately that that was something very wrong and very bad, but he didn't. Well, that's his fault. That's his failing as an entertainer.
You mentioned that if China had 2 or more parties, it would be worse. But how can one party become better? Will it itself become better, or some outside force to help it be better? What do you think the outcome will be?
Yeah. Can the one party become better itself, or does it require outside force? I think it does require outside force. I think both inside and outside together have some hope of making that party together. We don't know yet for sure whether it can be done, but I think it looks hopeful if the leaders are determined to make it a better party, and if there's enough pressure from the people to force them to do it and to put pressure on the opposition, I think it may happen. But it's going to take both of those, popular pressure and action from on top. You know, I think Wen Jiabao, recent premier, I think he sincerely wanted to carry through some political reforms, but wasn't able to do it. He couldn't get a majority in the leadership to move forward against the opposition. Xi Jinping is a different kind of person, and maybe he can do it, or maybe not. I mean, in my opinion, I don't know yet, but I think if the party is not able to reform, and really thoroughly reform, then one day the people will get up and reform it for them. There's no other alternative, I don't think. Because the system needs to be reformed. And anybody you talk to in Beijing will tell you that. Everybody, right, left, or center, they all say yes, 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 but they mean different things by it. And I think the big conglomerates, the big monopolies, and the big banks are all against real reform. So we'll see this Central Committee plenum later this month, supposedly. According to what they're saying in advance, they're going to break through the opposition and reach agreement on basic economic reforms. If they can reach agreement on and carry out basic economic reforms, I think you'll see the political reforms will follow. Because you cannot run a free market economy without more political freedom, long term. I don't believe it works. So if they really free up the economy a lot more, I think we'll see that the pressure on expression of opinion and so on will go away. That's what I'm hoping. I think this guy is trying to work up all the possible support he can get from people and to sort of paralyze the opposition so that he can carry through the economic reforms. Is this right or is this wrong? We'll see. Yeah.
I will ask this question in Chinese. Xi Jinping 最近对那个在毛泽东诞辰120周年这个事儿想做得很大，然后这个你从你的觉得，你觉得这个对这件事情是乐观态度，还是你怎么看这件事情？是说习近平不要重举毛泽东的一些观点吗？
I think his attitude towards Mao Zedong, I think what he said some time ago in a speech, he said we should not negate, we should not wipe away the memory of Mao Zedong, even though he made those terrible mistakes, the Great Leap Forward, the Cultural Revolution, and so on. But looking at his whole history, including the founding of the PRC, unifying the country, so on and so forth, we should not make him into a completely bad person. We should continue to respect him. I think that's right. And I think it's very important to study some of his writings critically. Study them critically. Because the man was a great thinker, in my opinion. I mean, his strategy and tactics in the war is something that is studied at West Point in this country. It's something that was a marvel. You know, you read his lecture on protracted war. It's a masterpiece of how to analyze the strong points and weak points of the other side, your own strong points and weak points, and how to use your own strengths against your own weaknesses, and use your strengths against the other guy's weakness, instead of trying to deal with his strengths with your weakness. Use your strength against his weakness, not the other way around. These are works of genius, and incidentally, in solitary, I got a great deal of support from studying on protracted war and figuring out what my own strengths and weaknesses were in that situation and how to deal with it. So I think it's important. You know, you have this cultural treasure in China. The only time in history, I think, where the top leader has tried to educate the entire country in a philosophic viewpoint, which, if you take away the part about class struggle and the politics of the time, was really a brilliant version of the scientific method. Do everything through trial and experimentation, you know. That the leadership should be a processing plant for processing the demands that come from the people and forming policies that meet their demands, the mass line. These are brilliant things, and to have this national treasure that nobody else has and not to study it and carry it forward, seems to me that's a great pity. And I think he's trying to correct this, and I hope it works.
Hi, Sydney. I have a question. So, do you think at its root, the Chinese Communist Party, or any Communist Party for that matter, is a democratic entity, or is at root more of a totalitarian regime?
This party is definitely not democratic. Definitely not democratic. They don't pretend to be democratic. The old party, before coming to power, was much more democratic than this. I mean, I've been at meetings in the Taihan Mountains in 1948 where there was strong criticism of Mao and his policy. And it was normal. It was no big deal. But you couldn't do that later. And I don't know about right now, but until fairly recently, couldn't do it either. party members, even at party meetings, were not really allowed to criticize the decisions of the Central Committee or to oppose them. You weren't supposed to. That's what my friends tell me anyway. So, not democratic. I think it needs to change itself into a democratic party, and that's what some people are working on. But they're great obstacles. There's so much corruption. So much corruption. How many people are there in the Communist Party that are really interested in communism? How many people are there in the Communist Party that really are dedicated to serving the people? There are some, but how many? I went to lecture at Tsinghua University a few years ago at a seminar for graduate students studying how to be entrepreneurs. And there was a young woman in the question period. At Tsinghua, she said, I joined the Communist Party here at school because I believe in the ideals of communism and I want to work for them. But all my classmates laugh at me. They say I only joined because I want a career. I want to get ahead, in life. And she started crying. She said, I don't know how to deal with that. So there are people in it that are not just in it to get ahead in life, but it's very, very corrupted. I mean, that's what you have to start with. So how far are you going to get in reforming it? Open question. I think nobody knows. I think you can't say in advance, oh, you'll never be able to do it, because you don't want to do that. If somebody's really trying, you want to support them as much as you can, but we just don't know. Yeah.
很谢谢你讲了这么多非常的insightful 的那种 idea。你有没有听说过那个薄熙来的审判案？对此你有什么看法？
薄熙来, I think, 薄熙来 has been known to be a bad egg for a long, long time. So there are two questions in my mind about that trial. First one is, so how did he get so high? I mean, in the Cultural Revolution, he was part of the cruelest, most brutal Red Guard group in the Cultural Liandong. They used to drive in these three-wheel trucks through the streets of Beijing with a big bass drum in the back of the truck. Somebody's sitting in the back and boom, 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 boom on the truck. On the side of the truck was written 红色恐怖, Red Terror. And they would go and grab people and kill them, torture them, whatever. They were actually the only red group that was against Mao, but not openly. They were taking revenge for their parents who were being struggled against. So you had Bo's sons and this one's son, that one's sons, defending their parents is the way it started. So even Jiang Qing put them in jail for a while because it was so brutal. Later on, she pulled them out and cried over them and said, you poor children, and so on. And they went back. But so he's always been a bad guy. So how did he get up so high? Secondly, none of his really major crimes were even mentioned at the trial. I mean, I think the trial was fine and great that a lot of the stuff was published, but what was it? $50 million in corruption? Chicken feed. Chicken feed, that's nothing to what they actually stole. Everybody knows that. Someone in the Ministry of Finance said last year, and we will protect his name, that of all the 9 members of the Central Standing Committee, at that time it was 9, it's now 7, every one of them, not one family has less than 100 million US dollars. Not one. So that's what you have to deal with. That's the facts of life. But this was not touched in the Boshilai trial. You know, and he kept his part of the bargain. He didn't say anything about it when he spoke about his other wealth and other people's wealth. So, you know, it's the old saying is true, 积重难返. You got such an accumulation of problems that it's not going to be easy to deal with them. But I think they will be dealt with. China is a country, James Fallows, who I think is one of our really good American journalists, has said this about China. There's a tremendous momentum of forward movement in China. You don't feel here. I'll give you an example. We went to this, there's this big building in Beijing called Bainao Hui. I don't know if you know whether all these electronic devices are sold. And so we went to one of the Apple stands there, and I was getting an iPad, which the Apple store didn't have yet. So I asked the woman, this middle-aged woman who was the boss, I said, where do you get them? She said, we don't know. They bring them in suitcases and we buy them. This was a registered Apple product, not counterfeit. Okay? So I said to her, I said, you know, some people think that in 5 years, the GDP in China will be larger than in America. And she said, oh, it won't take 5 years. You try to find somebody in this country that will say something like that about our economy. You can't find them. So in spite of all the problems, all the corruption, all the backwardness, there's tremendous forward momentum in that country. And I personally feel certain China will continue to move forward very fast. And I think it's the best hope of the human race, really. Because the Chinese, in spite of all the ultra-nationalistic hollering, are a peace-loving people. They don't want to fight wars. They don't want to grab anybody else's territory. You know, they want to get along and do business. I think that's the best hope that the world has, is the continued growth of China.
I think the last question we can take for today's talk.
Sorry. I read you also took a lot of consulting job to help American business do business in China, bring Chinese business here. So what do you think of the economic independence of China and U.S. in another 50 years? And also, the second question is, what kind of sorry, say one. Sorry.
Smuggling.
What kind of advice do you have to young people to do business across two countries?
I'm sorry, I missed that.
What's your quick advice to young people?
Young people?
Doing business across two countries. Thank you.
Well, in the first, the economies of these two countries are competitive in some areas, but they're much more supplementary. They supplement each other much more than they compete. I think this process will continue. We'll do more and more business with China, and we will reach strategic agreements on world resources with China, I think, like petroleum and copper and things of that sort. We'll reach agreement on how to exploit these resources. There's an old saying, the course of true love never runs smooth. So we will continue to quarrel and argue and shout at each other over all kinds of issues, especially trade issues. That's part of the bargaining, negotiating process. But I think the relationship will move forward. It's actually moved forward in every administration so far, every president. When they're campaigning, they all curse China, and they're going to be tough on China. When they actually get in the White House and they have to deal with the real world, they do what needs to be done. So I think the outlook there is pretty good. Young people, there is a tremendous need for people that can communicate with both cultures and who are honest, who have integrity, to act as marriage brokers, as go-betweens between American and Chinese business, both for Americans going to China and for Chinese coming here. They need to have someone that can help them, because the issues that Americans have going to China are very simple, really. First of all, you have to find the right people to talk with, and you have to find dependable people, people you can rely on to keep their agreements. And to do that, the only way you can do that is by investigating internally. You have to have people that know what they're doing. So I think it's a great future for young people in U.S.-China business. And if you fall in the ocean and drown, don't blame me for saying that.
So thank you for this.
Thank you.